Okay, so here we see a parental cross of a wild type. Now I believe this is going back to those Pika animals. But here we have a wild type cross with an albino, and all of the F1 have the wild type phenotype. And when we look at the test cross in this chart, we see about a 1-to-1 ratio of wild type to albino phenotype. So it says write out the cross or the genotype of the parental generation. Well, for all of the F1 to be wild type, that would imply that the wild type is going to be true breeding crossed with an albino. Okay, and then which phenotype is dominant? Well, the wild type phenotype is dominant because we know that all of the F1 are heterozygous and display that wild type phenotype. Now it says write out the test cross of the F1 individuals. Okay. Why were the results in a 1-to-1 phenotypic ratio? Well, because when we do the Punnett square, we see that that hybrid individual is going to have their alleles separate during gamete formation, and 50% of the offspring are going to inherit that dominant allele, and 50% will inherit that recessive allele, giving us a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, if we look at a second row in this chart, it says brown eyes crossed with red eyes. And actually, let's go ahead. I'm sorry. Why don't we, since the next one is dealing with brown versus red eyes, and we'll probably use a B for brown eyes, let's go ahead and switch this just for our records to A's, just to make following the traits a little easier as time goes on. Okay, so here when we look at this, based on the data for brown and red eye phenotypes, what is the pattern of inheritance for brown eyes? Well, when we cross a brown eyes with red eyes, and all of the F1 have brown eyes, we're going to assume that brown eyes is inherited autosomal dominant. How do you know? Because when we cross this brown eye individual with a test cross, we get a 1-to-1 ratio of brown to red eyes, just like we saw in this cross here with fur color of wild type versus albino. So, here we go. In this, here we are looking at now both of those traits. And we see when we take a wild type Pika with brown eyes and cross it with an albino red-eyed Pika, all of the F1 are wild type with brown eyes. Now, when we test cross the wild type with brown eyes, we find that the offspring come in 4 variations. There's wild type with brown eyes, wild type with red eyes, albino with brown eyes, and albino with red eyes. So part A says, explain why there are no red-eyed offspring in boxes 5 and 8. So here's box 5 and box 8. And there are no red-eyed offspring in this cross or in this cross because red eyes is recessive. So this individual here would be, for eye color, would be heterozygous, and same thing here. So that recessive allele is hidden or masked by the dominant allele in the hybrid. So now it says, set up and complete the cross that resulted in the data found in box 9. So we have a wild type for fur color that is heterozygous because it's part of the F1 phenotype. This is the same like wild type that we found up here. And then we have, for brown eyes, we also have another heterozygote. We can go like this. So we have here hybrid and a hybrid for these traits. And it's test crossed. Test crossed means recessive for both. So now we're going to set up what we call a dihybrid cross. This is for looking at inheritance of 2 traits. We want to think about the gametes that are possible in this individual. So if we look at Mendel's law of independent assortment, if these are unlinked traits, that means that their chromosomes as a diploid will go like this. But there's really 2 possibilities during the first couple steps of M phase of producing gametes in M1. You could have them assort to the middle of the cell like this or like this. So when we produce gametes, you could have some gametes that are dominant for both and recessive for both, or a dominant and recessive, or a recessive and a dominant. So it all comes down to independent assortment and how these chromosomes assort to the middle of the cell. Or you can do something similar to like the FOIL method in math. So when we talk about gametes being made in Mendel's law of segregation, these two A alleles are going to separate and end up in gametes. But they're independent of the B alleles because they're located on separate chromosomes. So here, the A could separate and end up in a gamete with a dominant allele for B, or when they separate, it can end up in a gamete with the recessive allele for B, which is what I saw here. So the dominant A could end up in a gamete with a dominant B, or the dominant A can end up in a gamete with a recessive B. It all depends on which side of the metaphase plate that those chromosomes move to. Now for the lowercase a, the recessive A could end up in a gamete with a dominant allele for B, like we see right here, or it could end up in a gamete with a lowercase b, like we see right here. So these are the 4 different combinations that could happen in this F1 individual for the different possibilities of their gametes. Now in the test cross individual, as their alleles separate, we see here that all of their alleles are going to have a lowercase a. And if we look at how their B alleles separate during Mendel's law of segregation, all of their alleles are going to have a lowercase b. So that makes our life a little easy. We know that the only combination is lowercase and lowercase, or recessive and recessive. So even though they make 4 gametes, all 4 are going to be, are going to be the exact same. That's the only combination possible in that test cross individual. So now let's pretend the test cross was the male, so this represents the sperm. And what we see here is if this sperm were to fertilize this egg, what kind of offspring would be produced? We see here we'd have a dominant A and a recessive A, a dominant B and a recessive B. Then if this sperm fertilized this egg, we would have a dominant A, a hybrid, but a homozygous recessive for the eye color, like this, and again like this. Now, if you wanted to, you could continue to fill these in, but as we see, they're all going to be the exact same. So that saves us a bit of time, and what we notice is there's a 25% chance of this combination, 25% chance, 25% chance, and a 25% chance. So you would write this as a 1 to 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, all equal likelihood. So when we look at, well, what do this offspring look like? Well, this offspring would have the wild type fur color, and it would have brown eyes. And then this offspring would have the wild type fur color, but would inherit red eyes. This offspring would be albino, but it would have brown eyes. And then this offspring would be albino with red eyes. And we can see that the 4 combinations up top in our box 9 are all pretty close to a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio. So this is how you set up and complete a dihybrid cross shown in this picture.